afternoon once again to one and all. A very warm welcome to each and every one of you. On behalf of the Open Campus and the Central Bank of Barbados. Indeed, a very special welcome to our esteemed presenter, Dr. Jules. Thank you, sir, for entertaining us this afternoon. And I have recognized a few educators in our audience. We want to say a very special thank you for all of you for coming. I've also recognized some members of MISA in the audience as well. Thank you for coming. And of course, the Ministry of Education. We are very pleased to have an audience as esteemed as this one. The educators and those interested in education in this country. The lecture series has a very proud history of which the Central Bank and the Open Campus are both proud of. And this afternoon, there's no difference in the way we have conducted our lecture series. And this afternoon, Dr. Jules is going to make his presentation, Challenges of Education in the Contemporary Caribbean. I know the topic is one that is gripping and that we're all anxiously awaiting. Without any further ado, let me ask Dr. Maureen Lucas, Head of Open Campus, to give the introduction of Dr. Jules. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not calling people by name, but I acknowledge the presence of a number of retired educators, retired public servants, and it is good to see that they have maintained an interest in the functioning of the education system. Ladies and gentlemen, the university in the Community Lunchtime Lecture Series, jointly hosted by the Open Campus Barbados and the Central Bank of Barbados, has, as one of its objectives, the sharing of ideas by preeminent West Indian intellectuals, preferably alumni of the University of the West Indies, and the scholars engaged in teaching, research, and service with the institution. Dr. Jules fits well into these categories, since he earned his first degree as well as the Executive Masters in Business Administration from the Cave Hill campus. To this day, his association with the UWI is still very strong, and his service to the institution outstanding. He currently serves as a member of the council of our campus, the Open Campus, and as a visiting consultant with the Arthur Lockjack School of Business at the St. Augustine campus. When one thinks of scholars in the field of education in the contemporary Caribbean, a few names come to mind. Didacus Jules is one of them. No wonder, therefore, that the university, not only the university, but governments of the region have consistently sought to tap into his intellectual skills, skills which he honed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he gained his MSc and PhD in curriculum and instruction. As most of us know, Dr. Jules currently holds the post of Registrar of the Caribbean Examinations Council, an assignment which he carries out with unflappable astuteness and vision. He is also chairman of the OECS Education Commission of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, chairman of the Foundation for the Development for Caribbean Children, and member of the Caribbean Child Support Initiative. Between 1997 and 2004, he served as the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Education and Human Resource Development in the country of his birth, St. Lucia. He was also a member of a 3-person consultancy appointed by the OECS Ministers of Education to develop the OECS Education Reform Strategy, which we all know as Pillars for Partnership and Progress. However, prior to that, he had heeded the call for a new Caribbean order, and between 1981 and 1983, served with our comrades in Grenada as the Permanent Secretary for Education and Culture, and in the same portfolio as Chief Education Officer in the People's Revolutionary Government. Dr. Jules tells me that he is very proud of that part of his career. And indeed, yesterday, when I was a bit careful as to whether I should speak to it, and I spoke with one of his secretaries, and I said, "You think I can speak about it?" She said, "Oh, he is extremely pleased to have served in that capacity." So I believe that he is going to bring a very radical and fresh and exciting approach to this lecture. But one of the highlights of that service was his organization of a transformative national literacy campaign. I have so far introduced you to the preeminent UWI intellectual, the Caribbean public servant extraordinaire, the revolutionist with a keen transformative agenda. But permit me now to share with you some of the highlights of the career of our comrade, the urbane internationalist. During 1992 and 1994, he served as interregional coordinator responsible for the organization of networking initiatives between regional literacy networks stretching from Asia, across the Arab region and Africa to the Caribbean, Europe, and Latin America. Beyond that, he has been involved in major international consultancies with the World Bank and with UN agencies. Comrade Jules has also published widely on topics ranging from poverty alleviation to educational policy. Finally, he has the distinction of being one of 17 intellectuals from around the world whose work and contribution to educational transformation was featured in the 2007 book by Peter Mayo and Carmel Borg entitled Public Intellectuals, Radical Democracy and Social Movements. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Conrad Didicus to speak on the topic, the challenges of education in contemporary Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Maureen. So it's a real setup, you know. I've been asked many times about the Grenada experience, and when people challenge me, sometimes I say, well, what can I say? There was a French philosopher who wrote a book that says, God is dead, Marx is dead, and I'm not doing too well myself. So thanks for coming to this seminar for the day, because a topic like this, really to be properly explored, requires quite some time, but I'm going to try to do justice to it within the period that I have. In the past decade, the narrative of education in the Caribbean has been a lamentation of failure, and in focusing on what is wrong, we have increasingly ignored what is also right. The problem with this unidimensional approach is that by not taking account of the water that half fills the glass, we fail to grasp the lessons of how the glass came to be half filled and better equipped to fill it. While there is much that is wrong, there are significant things that are right, and it is only by a thoughtful digestion of our experience that we can effectively envision the answers to the problems of today and shape the solutions of tomorrow. The reaction to the glass being half empty is also a panic, knee-jerk response, which, like a predictable stroke, is induced annually when the results of CSEC exams are released by CXC. I would not want to overdo the metaphor of the glass being half full and empty, but the reality is that, one, the glass being half filled did not become half empty overnight. Our persistent concern about the water level is always about the water level, and not with the leaks in the glass that account for the decline in water level. And of course, the reflexive discourse is about who is responsible for the water leaks, rather than an instinctive determination to fix the glass or even to change the glass. So let's be clear about the historical accomplishments of Caribbean education. The most critical thing to grasp is that the provision of mass education has been the single most important instrument of social and economic emancipation of Caribbean people. At every stage of our historical evolution, the expansion of education has provided the human resource underpinning required to support change in society and economy. In the post-emancipation era, it was the provision and expansion of primary education that facilitated the emergence of modern Caribbean society and the move from plantation economy to a more inclusive production economy. In the post-independence period, the expansion of secondary education facilitated the movement towards a service economy. And today, in the provision of tertiary education, it is the provision of tertiary education that will provide the human resource drivers for the knowledge economy. So let's turn to the emptiness of the glass, since that's an overwhelming preoccupation of press, parent, and pundit. Every year when CSEC results are released, the greatest preoccupation is always the issue of performance. And poor performance is invariably more attention-grabbing than good performance. There is hardly any time spent on the celebration of good performance where it presents, but an inordinate amount of pontification on poor performance. While weak performance is always a cause for concern, it is important that we put things in perspective. The problem of performance in Caribbean education is not simply a narrative of individual failure, but is also an expression of systemic meltdown. Put simply, that learners are failing in significant numbers is an expression of the fact that our education systems are fundamentally flawed, and despite comparatively higher ratios of Caribbean investment in education than even some OECD countries, we are failing to deliver efficiently and effectively. Let us focus briefly on some performance statistics spanning the last 8 years of CXC examinations to note some of the indicators of systemic failure. In CSEC, the percentage of candidates obtaining grades 1 to 3 increased steadily from 2006 with 58% acceptable grading to a peak of 68% in 2010, after which a pattern of decline emerges. In terms of territorial performance, the trends are generally common to all participating territories. And the abnormalities you see there because the registration numbers in SABRE submits 3 candidates a year to our examinations, and I might add parenthetically that we treat them with the equal respect to as Jamaica, which has the largest cohort, and Suriname, which offers less than a dozen candidates so far. We are in fact exploring opportunities for inclusion of the Dutch-speaking Caribbean in CXC. Regional performance in mathematics has consistently hovered between 30 to 40%. English, following a progressive improvement, has declined sharply in 2012. For most subject areas, the pattern has been one of decline except for information technology, which is not surprising given its convergence with candidates' fascination with ICT. Despite very low enrollment, the technical subjects have shown only slight fluctuation with relatively better performance than the academic subjects, although enrollments there are very low. Overall regional performance in Cape has fluctuated over the period. Territorial performance has trended to improvement in 2012, but the pattern of performance has been similar across territories. Regional performance in Cape technical subjects has been weak, with a significant decline in 2012. And I've put, you notice on some of those slides, the 100% bar there to give you a sense of the gap between acceptable performance and what is possible. The gaps in performance that we see from these statistics are symptomatic of a system in urgent need of quality improvements. The equity imperative is still hidden from view, and the most dramatic indicator of this is the percentage of the cohort who are not entered for examinations because they are deemed unable to sit CSEC by their school or whoever. If we are to compute the real percentage of acceptable grades in relation to that cohort, then we can gain a true appreciation of the arithmetic of wastage at secondary level. This constitutes not only a challenge of quality, but also of equity, as our unstructured observations at CXC suggest that the poor and the vulnerable are overrepresented in this educational purgatory. Parents as well as taxpayers may justifiably wonder about the unacceptable wastage of public resources and their private equity in a system which shows so little return for so many and so limited accomplishment for so few. Is it acceptable that after all of the investments by our governments and by parents over the 5 years of secondary education, a student is allowed to exit the system without even being given the opportunity to obtain the exit certification? Is it not a further indictment of the system that the only exercisable option is remediation that is more of the same diet? This reality goes far deeper than the statistics. When in some parts of the region, almost half of the cohort who entered secondary school will exit 5 years later without qualifications, without hope, and with a cultivated sense of failure, then the prospect of creating a Caribbean civilization becomes nothing more than an illusion. An examination of individual subject enrollment, whether in CSEC or CAPE, as a percentage of the largest subject registration, also provides us with another angle of perception on systemic wastage. It is generally accepted that for most forms of decent wage employment, a minimum of 5 CSEC subjects is required. Everyone sits English A, language, and mathematics, and the status of the other subjects are tenuous, and you can see them represented here. 62% of the entries, well, English is the largest cohort, so it stands at 100%. Mathematics, 96% of that entry base. 62% of the entries are in business subjects, but only 44% are in the sciences. The visual and performing arts, and remember that all of our leaders boast about the Caribbean having a global competitive advantage in the field of cultural expression. But 7% of the English cohort who enter is what enters for visual and performing arts. The technical subjects, 10%, despite the overwhelming rhetoric about technical and vocational education being so critical in these times. And I might add to, it is really sad the way we overlook what we have to seek what we don't have or what we don't own. Because from CXC will be 40 years old next year. From its inception, the technical subjects have been treated with equal weighting as the academic subjects. IT, 27%. English B, which is literature, is offered by only 23% of the candidates sitting English A. And we've often been asked, why does CXC not call it language and literature? I believe that it was named English A and English B because they were conceptualized as two sides of the same coin. Literature is the highest expression of language, and the mastery of language is incomplete without the sensibility cultivated by literature. The pattern is similar in CAPE, but encouragingly, the highest enrollments are in the business studies and the sciences. Cognate areas of concern are the technical subjects, with only 5% of the registration. And again, to come back to the political narrative, if we're serious about technical and vocational education and about, the participating in a knowledge-driven, ICT-enabled new age, then it is not enough for us to be doing TVET at basic skill level or TVET at CSEC level. We need to move TVET to higher and higher levels. I had the privilege of attending the World Conference on TVET in Shanghai earlier this year. And in the presentation on the Chinese experience and several other cutting-edge experiences, what was very clear and distinctive is that TVET has been treated as part of a seamless education system, so that the opportunities exist not just at basic skill level, but going right up to the highest levels of professional attainment. So here we see technical subjects with only 5% of the registration, IT with 7%, and visual and performing arts with 2%. Now I might add that we are going to, it will be interesting to look at these figures 2 years from now, because in September 2013, CXC is going to be launching a number of new subjects. One of them is Cape Tourism, which is not just your usual tourism product, but looks at opportunities and entrepreneurship for students wanting to fit into the tourism product to add value at a local and community level. We are looking at Cape Entrepreneurship, which would help students in a very experiential approach to the teaching of entrepreneurship to be equipped to set up and understand the world of business. And we are looking, for me, the most exciting one is Cape Digital Media, which would involve modules in film, digital media, and gaming. And interestingly, and as a departure from our usual form of assessment, where the SBA constitutes 40% of the grade, in the Cape Digital Media, the SBA is going to be 60% of the grade, and the exam will be 40%. And students will be required, as the SBA, to actually produce short film, whether it's YouTube using your smartphone or whatever, produce, at least design a game, and to actually produce a mobile app. So it's going to be really exciting, and I think we are going to see changes, because where student interest is peaked and people have there's a convergence between the aims of education and the aspirations of the individual, we see a difference. Yet another perspective on this challenge is the analysis of performance by subject, quote-unquote, past. And you see here the pie charts for the last 4 years. In the last 4 years, an average of 28% of the candidates sitting did not receive acceptable grades, which are grades 1 to 3 at CSEC, in any subject. In 2012, that group represented 33.4% of the cohort. On average, over the past 4 years, only 21.3% of the cohort received grades 1 to 3 in 5 or more subjects, thus becoming eligible for decent wage jobs or higher education opportunity. Performance is therefore an issue of the highest importance and integrally related to quality and equity concerns. But the challenge of performance is not only an issue of educational attainment, but it is also central to national competitiveness in a knowledge era. And this is a challenge for which we must find our own solutions. Let me repeat this. This is a challenge for which we must find our own solutions. There are no importable models. There are only instructive examples and experiences. I strongly believe that the elemental solution to every problem is buried in the soil of that experience, and that every problem turned upside down and inside out yields its own opportunities. After 50 years of independence, we really ought to be able to adequately digest the lessons of our history, envision a better future, and shape implementable and affordable solutions. Our survival in the brutally competitive global arena is absolutely contingent on our capacity to not just obtain, but to create knowledge. Our ability not just to do, but to do creatively. How is performance related to national competitiveness? The evidence is around us, all around us. Those of us who would have been following the US electoral contest would have heard that central to President Obama's argument for a different America is the case for rethinking American education to better prepare Americans for 21st century jobs. The countries that have best weathered the recessionary storm, and some of those who have thrived in these times of adversity, are those whose educational agenda has been bold, future-oriented, and fundamentally grounded in quality and equity foundations. Think Singapore, think Finland, think South Korea, China, Germany. At the core of the problem that we face in Caribbean education is the fact that our education systems have evolved from the inherited elitism of the British model and have adjusted to the pressures for wider opportunity, but have done so while retaining the DNA of their origin. And it is interesting, again, if you've been following the news, that the new government in the UK has determined that they are going to end this whole GCE thing and go to a baccalaureate that will require 2 years of study, a one-shot 3-hour examination. It is an absolute return to elitism, and the education community is up in arms against that. But yet within the Caribbean, there are people who still maintain that we ought to have remained with Cambridge. Actually, Cambridge has decided that the Caribbean, Cambridge, like the Privy Council, has decided that the Caribbean is going to be kicked out. I wish we could have special fees for those who come on board because the British kicked them out. Compounded this distorted growth has been the mutation of imported features in the image and likeness of the major donors of each epoch. Again, who pays the piper calls the tune. We have been totally subordinate, if you look at the history of educational development in the Caribbean, to the dictates of the donor community. So we created junior secondary schools when donors were financing the construction of junior secondary schools, and we subjected an entire generation of Caribbean people to secondary schools which were half a measure of what secondary education should have been, and eventually we had to expand these into full-fledged secondaries. And so we've added features of technical education from Germany and France, comprehensive schools from Canada, and a host of other imitations paid for by other people's money. Let us be clear, though, that not all of these mutations were bad. Some have stood the test of time, and the reasons why these have succeeded contain instructive lessons for future educational transformation. One quick example. 30 years ago, Canada built comprehensive secondary schools in my own country, St. Lucia, in Castries, Vieux-Fort, and Soufrière. What was revolutionary then was the fact that these institutions offered both academic and technical subjects in what was intended to be a holistic curriculum. Now, by itself, this may not have been a success because at the time, 30 years ago, technical education was infra-dig. These schools, however, have succeeded beyond expectation and are now schools of choice. The Castries Comprehensive School more so than the others. One might say that their success was in descending order of urban-rural placement, because the more urban of these were more privileged in the allocation of resources, and consequently were better placed to secure their reputation. And that's a pattern across the whole Caribbean. You're from town, you get the best. You're from country, you take the rest. But the elemental reason for the survival of this model lies, I believe, not simply in the strength of the model itself, but in the coincidence of the Caribbean Examination Council offering technical subjects on the same level as the academic subjects. So what that enabled a school like Castries Comprehensive to do is to pretend that initially they could really compete with a St. Mary's College, which is like the Harrison College of St. Lucia, by saying that we are entering our students for O-level type exams, and we offer in both technical and academic subjects on the same level. So this provided both validation and parity of esteem to both strands. The moral of this story is that the success or failure of educational implantations is determined not on the inherent attractiveness of the initiative, but on how well, how deep, and how integral the process of adaptation to the educational environment within which it is implanted. Without that environmental adjustment, like a poorly transplanted flower, it is doomed to wither. There are three macro features of the contemporary situation in the Caribbean that I want to point us to. The first is that despite its laudable expansion and the progressive movement from universal secondary to universal primary education, to universal secondary education, insufficient attention has been paid to early childhood development and stimulation. This is akin to the expansion of a house whose foundation has been neglected. Early stimulation of children 0 to 3 is an ongoing challenge, with many children having no access to structured programming. In 33% of countries for which there is information, there is a complete lack of any such programs at the state level. Charles and Williams 2012 warned, and I quote, "Data on participation rates in formal education programs expressed as a percentage of the eligible age cohorts across 7 countries show that significant portions of the early childhood cohorts are not exposed to structured early childhood programming. From the birth to 3 cohorts, the participation rates in 2009 ranged from between 17% and 41% for the entire cohort, with a similar gender profile. For the pre-primary cohorts, children aged between 3 and 5 years of age, the participation rates range from 65% to 100%. All of the latest research, end of quote, all of the latest research reiterates the vital importance of stimulation and development in the early stages for brain development, socialization, and motor skills. The second thing is the persistence of poverty and its deleterious effect on education. Education starts with the power to dream in any and all circumstances. And in too many cases, that capacity is stultified by hunger, poor nutrition, domestic strain, and weak support structures at home. Throughout the Caribbean, the state has made concerted effort to mitigate these impacts, but its ability to maintain structures of support and an adequate safety net is being threatened by the bruising impact of the global economic crisis. The third one is the urgent imperative of quality. CXC statistics discussed earlier speak to that issue. There is no, think about this, ladies and gentlemen, there is no industrial production line that would be comfortable with the degree of wastage that is represented in the weak learning outcomes that we see. Whether you're producing soap or bread or whatever, or cars, no industrial production line would tolerate that degree of wastage that we allow and we take as a norm within the education system. And education, mind you, is no production line. It is supposed to be the nurturing of sensibilities, the development of individual capacity, and the maximization of human potential. So fixing quality issues is not a postponable challenge. I come now to what do we need to do. The problems outlined may seem daunting, but the challenges are not insurmountable. In the inimitable words of Antonio Gramsci, good old radical Italian philosopher, what is required is that we maintain, and I quote, an optimism of the will despite the pessimism of the intellect. I would argue that there are three big picture approaches that we should be guided by. The first is to keep it simple. Effective education change must start from an understanding of the system as an ecosystem. This means taking a whole systems approach that enables us to see and to establish the alignments that need to happen so that every dimension of the system plays its role in support of the vision and the goals of the system. A weakness of change efforts of the past, not only in the region but worldwide, has been the tinkering with the system in unilinear ways. So if we think the last 20, 30 years, pick any country in the Caribbean, and governments declare the critical priority is primary education, and we must fix the primary curriculum. So there's a huge, usually, well, historically, USAID-funded primary education curriculum, millions of dollars spent, hundreds of people engaged to redevelop a new primary curriculum. And the new primary curriculum is developed, and sometimes they forget to train the teachers, or the training of teachers is a token sensitization to the new curriculum. We do not look either at the implications of that new curriculum in terms of the resources of the school to deliver that curriculum. We don't often look at the kind of educational support material, as in textbooks and other stuff required to drive the curriculum. We do not look at the forms of assessment of the new curriculum to be sure that our assessment of that curriculum is in line. I know that is one of the beautiful things about working in a place like CXC, because at the end of the day, no matter what education reforms you do, teachers will always teach to the test. So the new thinking in CXC is, if teachers will always teach to the test, and we then change the way we test, then we force the system to change the way they teach and the way people learn. Right? I think it was a guy called Hansen who said that people are not so much described by tests as constructed by them. And if you think about it, this is so important for the futures of your children. What happens to your kid at common entrance? Their results then marks or scars them for life. CSEC, the same thing. Right? That determines the doors of opportunity and the permutations that are open to you. So, knowledge paradigms have also changed fundamentally, and the information and communications revolution has dramatically altered everyday life in the global village. This poses a challenge for all, from the most technologically sophisticated to the least developed, but it has also created unprecedented opportunities for leapfrogging from periphery to closer to center. The emergence, for example, of mobile cell phones in Kenya, almost rendering fixed lines obsolete and facilitating an array of mobile services that have been reshaping opportunity for farmers, fishermen, housewives, and rural and urban folk. The lesson of the Kenya experience, in fact, Kenya, I think, has the highest penetration of mobile banking anywhere in the world right now. The lesson of the Kenya experience is that problems can be converted to possibility and obstacles to opportunity. Making this transformational leap, however, requires revolutionary and not evolutionary change that is becoming increasingly recognized. So Ken Robinson, and I would advise you all to Google, look for TED Talks, Ken Robinson, was very clear about this. He said every education system in the world is being reformed at the moment, and it is not enough. Reform is no use anymore because that's simply improving a broken model. What we need is not evolution, but a revolution in education. This has to be transformed into something else. My second issue, back to basics. Getting back to basics requires that in taking the whole systems approach, we first of all seek a better articulation of the various levels of the system so that their interconnectedness is strengthened. Each education sector can no longer be treated as a silo. The interdependencies must be remapped so that we recognize that the contributing output of each, what the contributing output of each is to the succeeding level. Early childhood development must be contextualized as creating the physiological and cognitive capacity that determines human potential. Primary education should set the foundation that guarantees core literacies and the ability to continue learning throughout a lifetime. And those of us of my generation, I'm happy there are some retirees here, can easily recall the solidity of the primary education that many of our parents received that enabled them, without the benefit of easy access to secondary and higher levels, to continue to learn and develop professionally and personally. A lot of the icons of Barbadian society, going back 50 years, were not people with secondary education or university degrees. They had solid primary education, but they were equipped with the capacity to continue learning and the emotional and other intelligences that enable them to move and to thrive. Secondary education is the new basic, the new foundation benchmark for 21st century learning. It must ensure that the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to survive and to soar are achieved. A fundamental difference between the old and new directions is that our systems must now define and create multiple pathways to success. The unilinear pathway, which only allowed one road in one direction for progress, must now give way to a multi-lane highway with loops, facilitating changes in direction and speed, more varied certification, catering for learners of different ages and stages. Given the historical deficits that we have accumulated in the past 2 decades, creating robust opportunities for second chance education is an urgent imperative. The ultimately strategic response to the psychosis of criminality, vulnerability, and hopelessness is education. And the accommodation of the education system to that huge out-of-school demographic will enable us to create the learning and caring nation. I am pleased to announce that the Caribbean Examinations Council has just concluded agreement with USAID on a major second chance education project that will facilitate a major outreach to institutions that currently seek to address this social and educational deficit, including, by the way, prisons in all of the participating territories. And the reinforcement of our certification in CXC to create these multiple pathways. The fundamental message of this initiative is that everyone has the capacity to learn, and second chance education is not second-class education. We want to take you from where you are to where you want to be. Thirdly and lastly, keeping the focus on learning. And the World Bank in its lead up to the new Vision 2020 document had done a sort of wiki approach, inviting people from all over the world to contribute ideas to this. And I can't claim credit from the Caribbean for this, but this was certainly an input that was made from the Caribbean to the World Bank, thinking that the focus of education has to be on learning. We must refocus our attention on learning outcomes. We have for many years defined educational progress by its inputs. How much money was spent by ministries, how many teachers were qualified, how many students were given access to secondary education. But we avoided the harder question of what precisely have we accomplished in terms of learning. Keeping the focus on learning will require some elemental mindset changes from the very top to the ground level of the education system. Ministries of education must begin to see themselves not as command centers, but as service centers, whose only raison d'etre is to facilitate the learning in the entire country. from chief education officer to classroom teacher, must understand that the reason they professionally exist is the learner. The school must become the center of focus of the education system. Some of the performance statistics presented earlier raised troubling questions about wastage of resources, but more disturbingly, of the waste of human possibility and capability. The 56% of the 2012 cohort who obtained acceptable grades in only one or no subjects are the casualties of a system in which failure is structural. The unknown and unrecorded and uncared numbers who enter secondary school but will leave without even an opportunity to sit a terminal exam are the silent shadows that will return to haunt you in the street corners or attack you in your home. They are available recruits for the desperate and the dispossessed who our system has condemned to failure. In concluding, allow me to state that while the pursuit of excellence must be an immovable goal, this will require a different approach to failure. It was Winston Churchill who said that success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts. And in persevering, we should be mindful of the admonition of Francis Bacon that there is no comparison between that which is lost by not succeeding and that which is lost by not trying. Standing as we are in this twilight purgatory, let it not be said that we lost by not trying.